Hi, I'm just going to run a few of my cross-process actions on a few different images to show you how they work and how they're tweakable. And I'm going to start off with this picture here. So the first cross-process action I'm going to use is dawn, and this one has sort of reddish tones. It's nice for that kind of soft morning or evening light. And if you go into the layers palette, you can see how they're made up. And you can turn off each one and turn it back on again, just so you can see what each layer does. So in here we have, in the vintage layer, it's a curves adjustment layer. And the way it works is these lines down here, the black line is the RGB, and if you slide that up and down at the edge on the left hand side, that affects the dark areas of the picture. If you slide it this way, it affects the light areas. So you can see what happens if you roll them up and down. And what I've done for this action is I've put more blue in the shadows, and I've also put more red in the shadows. So that starts off by giving it a sort of it adds a little bit of colour to the shadows, and that's what gives it the vintage look. Generally, vintage photographs were faded slightly with age, so the blacks wouldn't be true, and depending on whether they'd been in sunlight or not, they would be affected, and in a certain way the darks would be affected in a certain way. And that's why if you start messing around with the darks in a picture with this curves adjustment layer, that's why that happens that way. Now the other layers that I have are a contrast layer. That's a levels of contrast layer, and this is where the darks are affected. This is the midtones, so you can raise the brightness of the midtones by moving that, and this is the highlights. And the next one we have, and that's set to 50%. The next one here is called dawn. It's a red, and I've set it to soft light and an opacity, a low opacity of 25%. And you can see what that does. It just does a global color effect across the whole picture. And this top one here is yellow, and it's set to multiply. And multiply, you can, if you add a layer and you set it to multiply, it will darken the whole layer. So that has to be right down at the bottom, otherwise it'll just be like that. It's just like a filter over the whole thing. So you can put that nice and low, and it can affect it in a nice way. So that's basically how all of the actions work in that way, and you can then tweak each one to your taste. So if you run the action and it suddenly looks way too dark, well, then you can go in and you can affect the contrast and brighten it up a little bit if you want. So that's what the dawn looks like on that picture. So I'll just take that off, and then we have the sunset, which is not a multiply or an overlay layer, but it's actually a gradient layer. So you can see what colors that I've added to the gradient, and you can click on and change those colors if you want. And you can also roll it around so the gradient starts from a different area, and maybe you want to start the gradient from where the light comes from. That might make more sense to your picture. So that's adjustable that way. Again, highlights and that vintage look, which adds a little bit of colour to the shadows. So the next one is 70s look. Now with the 70s look, the most important one on this one is the sunshine set to multiply. It means that if you've got any areas that have been blown out completely by shooting directly into the sun, or you've just blown some white areas, it'll add a layer of colour to that. So it sort of lessens the effect of it having been blown out. I wouldn't recommend it to fix an overexposed photograph, but certainly if you like how the light has affected everything else and there are a few blown spots in your picture, then this 70s look, even if you just take that sunshine layer, you can see how it stops the brightness being too dark. Now that is very similar to what I have down here in the editing actions. It's just called lemon sky, and that'll do the same thing. If you've got some very blown whites, lemon sky can help to just tone down the very white areas. So I'm going to use this picture now. This picture is a little bit darker than the other one, and for this one I'm going to run aubergine on this one. Aubergine brings out some of the purple tones. That's quite a nice one. That's just a new one that I've added. Sand will brighten up everything. That really does make your dark. It lessens the contrast. It does bring a lot of light into the dark areas. And vintage is just quite an ordinary vintage look, but it's also got a soft light layer that softens it up slightly, which you can turn on and off, but it's quite nice to bring that back in again. If you run it without that, sometimes the skin tones look a little bit purplish, so you can bring that in, and that brings a nice skin color back into the skin. And for peachy is quite it's quite an extreme warming of the picture, so I would only really use that on a very cool picture. So that's that one there. But that's very similar to the warm haze. It's just a more extreme warm version of it. And warm haze is a lovely one, and the warm haze is a lovely one for indoors as well. Now for the black and white conversions, there's a few different ones. I'm going to show you the fresh black and white, which is the most highly contrasted one, and once you run it, you can then see, okay, well, I like the way it looks, but maybe there's a few too many dark bits in her hair. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with my black brush at 100%. I'm going to click on the layer mask of the levels contrast, and I'm just going to bring those back in. So you know, if you run it and it looks too contrasty, you can always go in and soften that effect. And then if you think, well, I'd quite like it to be a little bit brighter in the midtones, you can also do that. Now that's why I've left them all tweakable. So you can go ahead and change each one if you like. And then the same with this one here. I'm going to try the soft black and white. And you can see how it just makes a nice soft, not too contrasty black and white, which is nice for newborns. And in each of the, in 3 of the black and white conversions, there's a warm layer, and that's just adding a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow, and that's what makes it warmer. But you can take that off if you prefer your black and whites just to be absolutely plain. So I'm going to try the vintage on this one. And you can see what the vintage does. It gives quite a particular style to the picture, which you may or may not like, but it can sort of tie together a whole session if you add a certain cross-processing actions to it, and that's one. So let me just knock that back, and the other one is the low contrast film black and white. And you can see what that does. It's added, I'll just break it down here. So the first thing that goes on is a noise layer to give it that old film look, which can be very sweet sometimes. And also you can knock that off as well if you want. Then there's the contrast, there's the warm layer again, which you can take off or put on, and then this layer here, it's a multiply layer set 25%, and that just knocks off the highlights. It's quite a popular look at the moment. So there's a few of the cross-process actions for you to have a look at.